Eastern Front, summer 1943, 3 in the morning. The war on the Eastern Front has been grinding for 2 years. German soldiers stationed along these lines have learned to fear many things. Soviet artillery, tank battalions surging out of nowhere, the brutal Russian winter. But there is one sound, a soft, whispering sound, that turns even hardened veterans cold with dread. It is not the roar of engines, it is the absence of them. No radar can find them, no infrared locator can track them. They are too small, too slow, too primitive for the technology of modern war. They are made of plywood and canvas, the same material as crop-dusting planes. They carry 2 bombs each, nothing more. No radios, no machine guns, no parachutes. The German soldiers have a name for this sound. They say it is the sound of a witch's broom sweeping across the sky. They call them the Nachthexen, the night witches. What the Germans did not know, what they refused to believe even when they were told, was who was flying those planes. They were young women, most of them barely 20 years old, students, musicians, engineers, athletes. They had volunteered to fight. They had been handed the worst planes in the Soviet Air Force and told to make do. And they had, night after night, for 3.5 years, made the most powerful army in the world lose sleep. This is their story. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German and Axis troops crossed into the Soviet Union simultaneously along a front nearly 3,000 kilometers wide. The Soviet military was caught catastrophically off guard. In the first weeks alone, thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed, many still on the ground. Entire armies were encircled and eliminated. By autumn, the Germans were pressing on Moscow itself, and Leningrad had been placed under a siege that would last 900 days. The Soviet Union was bleeding at a rate no country in history had ever survived. Joseph Stalin issued emergency decrees. The entire country mobilized. Women took over factories, farms, hospitals, and anti-aircraft batteries. Hundreds of thousands enlisted as soldiers, nurses, and snipers. But in the air, in the domain of aviation, women were barred from combat. That was about to change. And it would take one extraordinary woman to make it happen. Marina Raskova was, by 1941, the most famous woman in the Soviet Union. She had wanted, as a child, to be an opera singer. A middle ear infection ended that dream, so she became a chemist, then an engineer, then, almost by accident, a navigator. And it turned out she was exceptional at it. In 1938, she and 2 fellow aviators completed a non-stop flight from Moscow to the far eastern coast of the Soviet Union, nearly 10,000 kilometers. When their fuel ran low over Siberia, Raskova bailed out over the wilderness with no food and almost no water. She spent 10 days alone in the taiga before rescue crews reached her. She emerged from the forest calm, composed, and ready to receive the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, the nation's highest honor, making her the first woman ever to earn it. The Western press called her the Soviet Amelia Earhart. Her face was on posters across the country. Young women worshipped her. Stalin admired her personally. And when Germany invaded, Raskova's mailbox was flooded. Letters came from all over, from pilots, from girls who had learned to fly in clubs, from women who had never been in a plane but wanted to fight. All of them said the same thing: tell us how to serve. Raskova read every letter. And then she went to Stalin. She argued that the Soviet Union was losing pilots faster than it could train them, that thousands of qualified women pilots existed, graduates of the flying clubs that had sprung up across the country in the 1930s, part of Stalin's own modernization campaign, that these women were being wasted on the ground while the war bled the sky dry. She was persuasive, she was famous, and Stalin, who was not sentimental but was strategic, understood the propaganda value of women fighting for the motherland. On October 8, 1941, he signed the order. 3 all-female aviation regiments would be formed immediately. the 586th Fighter Regiment, the 587th Bomber Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The women who would become the Night Witches had 2 weeks to pack their lives into a single bag and report to the city of Engels on the Volga River. They were sorted by skill. The most experienced pilots went to the Fighter Regiment. The second tier went to bombers. Those ranked lowest were assigned to the 588th night-bombing, obsolete planes, the mission nobody else wanted. In a bitter twist of irony, the women who would become the most feared unit on the Eastern Front were assigned that role because they were considered the least qualified. Their training lasted 6 months, an intensive compression of a course that normally took 18. They had to learn to fly, to navigate, to maintain their aircraft, to drop bombs, to survive. They did it on almost no sleep, in men's uniforms 2 sizes too big, eating rations designed for soldiers much larger than themselves. The training was not without cost. In March 1942, during a night exercise, 2 aircraft became lost in a blizzard and crashed, the first casualties of the regiment, before they had fired a single shot in anger. They kept training. By May 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was ready. The Polikarpov Po-2 had been designed in 1928 as a training aircraft. By 1941, it was already considered outdated by years. Its top speed was 150 kilometers per hour. The German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter, the plane that would hunt them, flew at over 600. A Po-2 could carry a payload of roughly 250 kilograms of bombs. Some Night Witch missions required 10 or more sorties to deliver what a single modern bomber could carry in one pass. The plane had an open cockpit, no heating, no armor. The canvas skin could ignite from a single tracer round. The women called it the kukuruznik, the corn duster. Some called it something darker. They called it a coffin with wings. The absence of parachutes was not an oversight. It was arithmetic. Each parachute weighed roughly 10 kilograms. Every kilogram removed meant more bombs could be carried. The women chose the bombs. Until 1944, the Night Witches flew without parachutes. If you went down, you went down. What the Night Witches lacked in technology, they replaced with ingenuity. Their tactics were so effective that German high command spent years trying to counter them, and largely failed. Missions were flown in groups of 3 aircraft. 2 planes would approach the target area first, flying low and slow, deliberately drawing searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. While German gunners were locked onto these decoys, consumed by the noise and light, the 3rd plane cut its engine entirely. Silent now, invisible. The pilot guided the plane in a long glide toward the target, the only sound a soft whisper of wind through wire struts and wooden wings, like a witch's broom sweeping the sky. Bombs released. Engine restarted. Gone. Then the decoys would slip away and return. And then all 3 planes, lighter now, faster, would fly back to base, reload, and do it again. Some nights, a crew flew 8 sorties, some flew 12. On one legendary night in 1943, veterans Nadezhda Popova and Yekaterina Ryabova flew 18 sorties between them before dawn broke. 18 takeoffs, 18 bomb runs, 18 landings in a single night. Once caught in a searchlight beam, a Po-2 was exposed to every gun within range. The pilot's only option was to dive and twist through the light. No armor, no evasive technology, just hands on the stick and the hope that the plane held together. Nadezhda Popova, who would become the regiment's most celebrated pilot, flying 852 combat sorties, once returned from a mission with 42 bullet holes in her aircraft, her helmet, and her navigation maps. She landed, climbed out, and walked to the briefing room to file her report. Another pilot lost the floor of her cockpit to enemy fire mid-mission. She completed the run and came home. 32 Night Witches were killed in combat over 3.5 years. Given what they were flying and how often they flew, the survival rate was a testament not to luck, but to skill. When Marina Raskova assembled the regiment, She needed a commander for the 588th, someone who could lead young women into the most dangerous skies on Earth and bring as many home as possible. She chose Yevdokia Bershanskaya, a civilian flying instructor who had spent years teaching men to fly in the peacetime clubs of the 1930s. Bershanskaya was not the most decorated pilot in the regiment. She was something rarer, an exceptional leader. She was the only woman in the entire war to receive the Order of Suvorov, an honor reserved for commanders who demonstrate outstanding tactical genius. She led the 588th from its first mission to its last. Her pilots adored her. The regiment was the only entirely all-female unit across all three regiments. Pilots, navigators, mechanics, armorers, ground crew, command. Not a single man served in any capacity. Bershanskaya insisted on it. If they were going to prove what women could do, they would do it without men. Nadezhda Popova was 19 years old when the Germans invaded. They occupied her hometown. Her brother was killed. Her friends were killed. Her childhood home was destroyed. She had been flying since she was 15. She had no doubt what she wanted to do. Popova joined the regiment and quickly distinguished herself, not only by her flying ability, but by something harder to quantify, an absolute refusal to be intimidated. On one mission, caught in a cone of searchlights over a heavily defended German position, she cut her engine, went into a steep dive, and glided silently beneath the light beams. A maneuver so audacious that the German gunners simply didn't know where she had gone. By the war's end, she had flown 852 missions. She was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union. She lived until 2013, dying at the age of 91. And she once said, in the measured, wondering way that only someone who has survived the impossible can speak, that she sometimes looked up at the sky and thought, we were young, we were flying, the stars were shining. The war was there, of course, but we were young and in love with life. If Nadezhda Popova was the regiment's spirit, Irina Sabrova was its relentless engine. She flew more combat sorties than any other member of the unit, 1,008 missions by the time the war ended. That number is so large it almost refuses to be comprehended. 1,008 nights of flying out into the dark over enemy territory. 1,008 times trusting a canvas and plywood plane and a compass and a stopwatch to bring her home. Polina Gelman had been studying at Moscow State University when the war came. She enlisted immediately and trained as a navigator, the woman who sat in the rear cockpit, reading the maps, calling the bearing, releasing the bombs. Navigation in a Po-2 at night was as much art as science. No GPS, no radio beacons. Just a compass, the stars, the shape of rivers and roads below in the darkness, a precise knowledge of time and ground speed, and the ability to calculate position by mental arithmetic under conditions that would terrify most people in daylight. Gelman flew 857 missions. After the war, she became one of only 2 Jewish women to receive the Hero of the Soviet Union in the entire conflict. Not all the Night Witches survived to collect their honors. Yevdokia Nosal was 24 years old when she was killed in April 1943, shot down by a German night fighter while returning from a bombing mission. She was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously, the first member of the regiment to receive it, and the first female pilot in the war to earn the title at all, even in death. The regiment mourned and then flew the next night. That was the rhythm of grief on the Eastern Front. You didn't stop. You couldn't stop. Stopping was dying in a different way. What defined the 588th was not just individual heroism, but collective identity. They were entirely women, from the commander briefing the mission, to the mechanics arming the planes, to the pilots and navigators climbing into the cockpits. This created something unusual in the middle of a war, a genuinely self-sufficient female world operating at the extreme edge of human experience. They looked out for each other in ways that the mixed gender units around them often couldn't. They shared food, warmth, fear, and grief. They decorated their planes with flowers. They painted their lips with navigational pencils before missions. They wrote poetry. They also fixed their own engines in frozen conditions, loaded their own bombs, and navigated by starlight with rulers and stopwatches. beauty and precision and danger, all occupying the same small cockpit. The Night Witches did not only fight the Germans, they fought, every day, the assumptions of the men around them. When they first arrived at the front, male pilots and officers were dismissive at best and hostile at worst. The women were considered a PR stunt, a propaganda exercise. They were given inferior equipment, older planes, fewer spare parts, no radios or machine guns, while male units in similar roles had them. When they requested better gear, they were often refused. There were incidents of harassment, of patronizing treatment from commanding officers who addressed them as children, of male pilots who refused to acknowledge their missions as real combat. The Night Witches responded by flying better. Every night, every mission, until the numbers were so overwhelming that denial became impossible. Eventually, slowly, grudgingly, respect came. But the women never forgot that they had to earn every centimeter of that respect in a way their male counterparts never had to. On the other side of the lines, the Germans had reached a very different conclusion. They were terrified. Not because the Po-2's bomb payload was strategically decisive, it wasn't, but because the raids never stopped. Night after night after night, the whoosh and the flash and the disruption. Sleep deprivation alone had measurable effects on German combat performance along sections of the front where the 588th operated. A 1944 internal German report estimated that constant night raids had reduced frontline efficiency by 15%, not from the bombs themselves, but from the psychological weight of knowing they were coming every night, and there was nothing to be done about it. German High Command took the threat seriously enough to offer the Iron Cross, their most prestigious combat decoration, to any airman who shot down a Night Witch plane. There were persistent rumors among German soldiers that the women had been given drugs that gave them feline night vision, that they were trained assassins, that they were somehow not subject to normal human fear. Over the course of the war, 32 members of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment were killed. Behind each name is a story, a family waiting, a letter that arrived and changed everything, a plane that didn't come back by dawn. The regiment had a rule, perhaps not an official one, but a real one. When someone died, you kept flying. You mourned on the ground in whatever hours the daylight gave you. When the night came, you flew. In February 1943, the 588th was redesignated the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. The title of Guards was the Soviet military's highest recognition of a unit's collective performance, reserved for formations that had distinguished themselves beyond all expectation. Later that year, after their missions over the Taman Peninsula, they received a second honor, the title of Taman. The women who had been assigned to night bombing because they were considered the least qualified now carried one of the most decorated regimental titles in the Soviet Air Force. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the ledger of the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment told a story that defied every assumption that had ever been made about what these women could do. 30,000 combat missions, 28,676 flight hours, more than 3,000 tons of bombs and 26,000 incendiary shells delivered, 17 river crossings destroyed, 9 railways damaged, 26 German warehouses destroyed, 12 fuel depots eliminated, 86 prepared firing positions suppressed, 155 supply drops to surrounded Soviet ground forces. 23 pilots and navigators received the Hero of the Soviet Union, more than any other women's unit in the history of the Soviet military. They had done all of this in biplanes made of plywood and canvas, without parachutes, without radios, without machine guns, flying at night over one of the most heavily defended military positions in history. On June 24, 1945, the Soviet Union held its Great Victory Parade through Red Square. Over 3 million German and Axis troops had been defeated. The war had been won. Soldiers who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin marched in formation. Aircraft flew in formation overhead. The Night Witches were not in the parade. Their planes flew too slowly. The Po-2, the coffin with wings, the corn duster, the weapon that had helped win the war, could not keep pace with the modern aircraft performing the victory flyover. So the regiment that had flown 30,000 missions in the dark watched from the ground as the war they had helped win was celebrated overhead without them. The treatment of the night witches after the war was not merely an oversight. It was a systematic erasure. The regiment was disbanded almost immediately after the armistice. The women were thanked, demobilized, and told to return to civilian life. They were not permitted to continue serving in the Soviet military. The doors of the Air Force, which they had fought to open, had held open through 3.5 years of night raids, were closed again. In the post-war Soviet Union, the story of the night witches faded from the official historical narrative. The women who had been celebrated in propaganda broadcasts during the war were now inconvenient. Some night witches found work in civilian aviation. Some became engineers, teachers, doctors. Some returned to the universities they had left in 1941 and quietly finished their degrees. They had saved their country, and their country had moved on without much acknowledgement. It took decades. Memoirists, historians, journalists, many of them women, began reconstructing the story of the 588th through interviews with surviving veterans, through military archives, through the diaries and letters that families had preserved. Books appeared. Documentaries were made. The name Night Witches entered popular culture. Some of the pilots lived long enough to see themselves celebrated again. Nadezhda Popova gave interviews into her 90s. The last survivors became living bridges between a world most people could no longer imagine and the present. Today, the Night Witches are studied in military academies, written about in dozens of languages, taught in classrooms, and recognized as what they always were: one of the most effective and courageous military units of the Second World War. Not female units. Units, full stop. They flew 30,000 missions into the dark. They were 19, 20, 21 years old. They were handed planes that no one else wanted, equipment no one else would take, missions no one else was asked to volunteer for. They flew anyway. Not because someone made them, not because they had no choice. Because Germany had invaded their country, burned their villages, killed their brothers, and they had decided, each one of them individually, with full knowledge of what it would cost, that the night sky was where they needed to be. History has a way of forgetting the people who did the most. The night witches were erased once. They will not be erased again. The last word belongs to Nadezhda Popova, pilot, flight commander, hero of the Soviet Union, who flew 852 missions before she was 25 years old, and who lived to be 91.
Almost every time we had to sail through a wall of enemy fire, I sometimes stare into the blackness and close my eyes, and I can still imagine myself as a young girl, up there in my little bomber, and I ask myself, Nadia, how did you do it?
That's the end of this video. Would you like to see more of it? I hope so. Let me know in the comments.